Alright, hey y'all, this is Angela here from the Chicken Coop. So this is part of the next video in my series of how to make a rag edge quilt. So I have cut out all my squares here, and I've got them situated where they're, with the back square that they're going to be with. And so there's 25 squares with backing on here, and the denim is the backing material. So, and then the next step is to of all these squares, I take those and I sew across down the middle of it, and I usually start a little bit from the edge here, and I just sew across here, and then the same thing right here, just a little bit from the edge and sew across. And that's kind of the quilting, and I don't put any kind of quilting in between, any kind of batting in between my squares. I just do that little cross. And believe it or not, when you finish this quilt, it's actually a pretty heavy duty little quilt for people. But like I say, if you wanted to put some batting in between, you could, and that would be, an extra step. So that's what I'm doing now. Is I'm sewing my X's into all these little squares, and then once that's done, I'll go on to the next step, and I'll show y'all that too. Alright, so I'm going to kind of show y'all me sewing this corner here. So I've gotten my needle is just a little bit off of that corner, and I don't do any lines or anything. I just kind of grab this corner right here, and I line that up, and I kind of make a straight line, and I just eyeball it. Now some people, this might be harder for them, but this quilt is a real forgiving quilt. If everything doesn't just line up perfect and everything, it's going to be okay, because it's that rag and edge, and so you're not even going to notice that. So like I say, I just kind of hold on to this corner and eyeball that, and I just start sewing, and I try to keep my thumb in line with my needle, my presser foot, and I just keep sewing here. I'm even doing this and filming, so, if I had both hands, it'd be a little bit better. But I kind of get to that edge, back it up a little bit, go forward, and I'm done. So that's how I sew and how I line everything up. Not hard, not complicated. Don't try to make this complicated. It's not a complicated little process here. But that's one of the steps when I do that crisscross sewing. Is that's how I do it. That's how I line it up, and my crosses are actually usually pretty straight. And then I just take these 4 pins, pin the next square, and I go on and get all these sewn. So that's my next process. So I'm going to get this pinned up and get all these squares sewn up, and then I'll show you all the next step. Alright, so we're back. So I've got all these sewn together, and my son helped me make up a little diagram, I guess, of how you put these together so that squares aren't near each other and all that kind of stuff. So here's the diagram, and so you've got 5 different kinds of material, 5 different prints of material. So what you do is, on a sheet of paper, you just take your 5 different prints and you number them 1 to 5, and you figure out what number you want to correspond to each one of your material prints. And then this is how you sew them together. This is how you put them together. So alright, so here is the grid again, and I have numbered each of my prints. I have the deer print, the arrow print with all 3 different colors, the sea blue polka dot print, the pillow ticking, and the blue jeans. So I've chosen 5 is my blue jean, and if you look on this grid, number 5 and number 2 will be on one sheet on 2 different rows here. See how this row right here and this row right here are kind of the same? So these 2 will kind of be the same. And then on this row, the first row, I've got 1 and 3. So that'll be the deer print and the sea blue. And then on this row, it'll be 3 and 4, which is going to be the sea blue and the pillow ticking. And on this one, it'll be the pillow ticking and the deer print. So that's kind of how it will come together. And when you put this all together, that way each print is not necessarily by another print. They're kind of all separated. So what I do is then I start taking, I get the 1s and 3s together, and I get those in, I pull them out and I put them in a stack all together. Then I get the 5s and the 2s and I put them in a stack all together. And then 3s and 4s, I put them in a stack all together. 2s and 5s again, and 4 and 1. And then I have all those stacks. And then you have to kind of be careful. This is where you need to be careful and really have this diagram close to you so that you sew them together in the stacks together, side by side. And I'll once I get these in the stacks, and I'll kind of show you what I'm talking about. Alright, so using my grid, looking at my grid that I've come up with, I've put everything in the stacks the way they're supposed to be sewn together. And what I do now is, like this first one, it's deer print, and then it's the seafoam blue. So what I take is I take the deer print, the seafoam blue, and I put them, the backing, which is the blue jean print, pin that together, backing to backing, along one side. Okay, and then I'm going to sew it using about a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And I'm going to sew down this edge. And then when I get ready to do the next square, I'm going to take this square here, and I'm going to pin this deer print right next up to this. And I'm going to keep going and make a long strip. That's the first row. And then I'm going to set that row aside. And then I'm going to do that with every row. And then once I have the rows done, then I will sew each row together. So that's what I'm going to do now is I have these all stacked up in the way they go per row. And I'm going to pin these together and start sewing each row together. So that's what I'm going to do next. Here's my 1/2 inch seam allowance here. And I have this material. See how there's a little bit of difference right here? That will not make a difference when you finish up ragging this quilt. That little bit of difference between your cutting will not make up a difference. But notice here how when I sew this little X right here, now when I come off a 1/2 inch off of this side over here, it matches up to that little X right there. Okay, I'm pretty much matched up to that. So I'm going to sew this, going down here, whole 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then just keep adding to that row and sewing it row by row. But make sure if you have a print on there that the prints all line up and they're going the same directions. So when you have your quilt set out, all the prints will be going the way you want them to. Like I have a stripe in there, so I can decide whether my stripe's going to go horizontally or vertically. Or I also have this deer print in here, so the deer, there is a top and a bottom to that print, so I need to make sure that those are all lined up the same way throughout the quilt. And that's why it's very important to get your stacks together so that you know you're sewing things in the right direction. They're all staying in the right direction. So I'm going to get this sewn up, and I'll show you what I mean when I'm done with this, okay? Well, actually I can just sew here with you. So I'm going to sew here. Back it up a little. And then I'm going to keep sewing here. And I can sew faster than this normally, folks, but I'm trying to hold my camera and do this at the same time, so I'm going a little slower. So I'm going to kind of end right there on that point. Back my fabric up. And go forward. Okay. So I'll bring this over here and show you what I'm talking about. So now, see, these edges are to the front. Okay? And then you're going to, we'll show you later, but that's why it's not going to make a difference if you've got your off a little bit. So all these edges to the front, and see how I have this print is facing upwards, like when you're looking at the deer, they're all facing right, okay? And I'm going to keep doing that. So now I have the next square that I'm going to put over here and pin it to this piece. And I'm just going to keep doing that in a line, and I'll have a row, one row completed. So let me get this sewn up, and I'll come back and show you what I'm talking about, okay? Okay, so I have completed my first row. And see how all the deer are facing in the same direction, and it's all, you know, 1/2 inch seam allowance, and there's like about, you know, a 1/2 inch from the top and a 1/2 inch from the bottom. That I start at a 1/2 inch from the top, and I start sewing there, and when I get to the bottom I also stop at about a 1/2 inch from the bottom. And then, so this is my first completed row. And so see why it helps to make sure that you have all your print in the stack like you need it to be, so that your deer print ends up being in the right direction when you sew and when you stack them together. So this is the first completed row. I'm going to sew all the rows together, and then I'll come back and show you how to sew the rows together. And that will be the next step that we complete. But this is easy sewing, and this is very forgiving, because if everything isn't just perfect, when you rag that's going to come out and you won't even notice. It's going to hide a lot of those blemishes or those things where it just doesn't add up. So this is a really good beginner quilt project. You don't have to be perfect at it, at sewing, to be able to complete this. Hey y'all, so it's Angela here, and I'm back with the next part of this sewing video on this rag edge quilt. So I've got all my squares sewed together, and I've got them in these long rows, all these long rows, and I've got them stacked up in the way that they go. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to show y'all, we're just going to take this this row, and we're going to take this next row, and we're going to pin them together. And try to show y'all what I'm doing here. What I try to do is I get where these are sewn together at right here, and I try to line them up as best I can, and hopefully when those are lined up that they will all line up together pretty well. And then I pin them right where those edges meet, because that's what's gonna, and I pin between all these materials here. Because we're going to sew across, we're going to open that seam up, and we're going to sew across those seam allowances here. Okay. And then I'm going to try to line up these squares best I can. Okay. And then we're going to go to this next one and kind of do the same thing. We're going to go all the way down this length of rows, these two rows together. And then hopefully these line up pretty good. You put a couple of pins in them. And just move down the way. Get these opened up, these seam allowances opened up. And I usually put one on each seam allowance so that it stays open. But you kind of have to be careful when you're sewing, because your presser foot, if you can actually open that back up, because you'll have to take that pin out when you sew across. And then sometimes your presser foot will try to open up, catch right here and open that seam allowance up, and then you sew it wrong. Such a pain. When you sew it wrong, that's just such a pain. And y'all, don't look at my hair today. It's been raining here in Texas. Yay, it's rained a little bit, but I know there's people down in Houston and stuff that's had too much rain. But we got some rain today, which was much needed for our area. I don't know how much we got, but anyways, I was out in the rain, and this curly hair is hard to tame anyways, and then when it gets wet, it goes crazy. It is just, there's no straightening this stuff out, y'all folks. This is my natural curly hair. Both my parents had naturally curly hair. All my sisters we all had naturally curly hair, and I mean, my hair is curly. Curly, curly, curly. And you know, I could fight that and straighten it and all that kind of stuff, but people, you know, will say, "Oh, your hair doesn't look as curly today. What'd you do to it?" And I'm like, well, actually, usually I have curled my hair to make it less curly, because my hair is that curly. It is extremely curly. And so usually to even get it to this loose bit of curls, I have actually curled it or blow dried it some to get it this uncurly, because my hair is extremely curly. My daddy had beautiful hair. My mother had pretty hair too, but my daddy had beautiful hair. He was jet black, and when he turned, of course, then he went, you know, salt and pepper, and then he went to snow white, and it was the most beautiful snow white hair. It was like Santa Claus Snow White, and it was so curly and everything, and he just had beautiful, beautiful hair. And it wasn't ever that
yellowy white or anything. It was just really pretty hair. Yeah, pretty hair. So I think I kind of take it. I've got a lot of, my curls are more like his curls than my mother's curls. So anyway, so I've got this whole row pinned up, and we're going to sew this row together just all along that. And we're going to try to keep these seam allowances opened up. We're going to sew straight across that. So you got to be real careful when you sew across those seam allowances and get those opened up. Okay? And so what we're going to do is I've got these 2 rows pinned together, and then I'm going to sew those, and then we're just going to keep on one row at a time adding to these rows, and then all these rows will be sewed together. So let me get this row sewed, and I'll kind of show you what it looks like, and then we'll come back. Okay guys, so I'm back, and I've sewn all these this row together, okay? Now I'm trying to show you this pretty good, but see how this this seam allowance is here, okay? And that will look better when you start ragging this and you clip all these little edges. You know, you clip them about a 1/2 inch apart down through here, and then that rags, you won't even notice that, okay? But see how these seam allowances are sewn across there, right across that seam allowance. Well, you can't see, there's a piece of thread there. Let's see. I'm trying to get it up here. See, I opened up those seam allowances and then sewed it together, okay? And when you can kind of look here, see how that's together? And then see how you need to make sure all your deer are up. So when I go to sew, you know, put pin on the next one, I got to make sure that this is still facing up, and this is the next row is going to go on here, okay? But that's what I'm going to do on all these 5 rows. Here's how the back looks. There's all these strings and everything, of course, but this is how the back looks when you sew it together. See? All these squares where you made these X's are all coming together on those corners. And that's how the back will look, okay? I just used a white bobbin so you can see. If you wanted to use a blue bobbin that matched this blue jean material, then that stitch would just kind of fade into the material and you wouldn't even notice it. See what I'm saying? Okay, so let me get this all pinned together and get all these sewn together, and then I'll show you the next step of there's one more step that you got to do once you get all these sewn together, okay? So I'll be back. Let me get all these pinned up together and sewn together, and I will show y'all the next step. All right, so I've sewn it all together, but there's just 1 or 2 more little steps I got to show you. Okay, so here's my quilt. It's all put together. It really looks cute. I'm very excited about it. But see how it looks? That's cute, isn't it? But all right, the next step is up here at the top. See, it's not sewn. See, like that. So we're going to go a 1/2 inch seam allowance all around. We're going to open up these seams as well, just like we did when we sewed them together. And we're going to go completely all around the circumference of this quilt. And then once we do that, we'll go back and clip all the strings and everything, and then we'll clip the edges to rag them, and I'll show you how you do that. But I just wanted to show you that is the next step. After you get all these rows sewn together, is we're going to go and sew around the whole circumference of this quilt, a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around. And that'll be all of our sewing is done. So we will have it finished. And the clipping of it, I usually take it into the living room and watch TV and just kind of work on getting all the edges and stuff clipped. And when we do that, I'll show you how that's done. And then this quilt will be completed, and I can give it to my friend for her precious baby. So I'm glad y'all stayed with me through this project. I know it's been kind of a lengthy thing. I've had to kind of stop and start, but we're almost to the end, so stay tuned, okay?
Alright everybody, here is one of the next to the last videos, and then I'll show the final product. But this, I've sewn all the rows together, and I am clipping them, clipping the raw edges. And as this gets washed, these raw edges will get more and more ruffled, more and more ragged. And so it will look more and more like a rag-edged quilt. But what you do is, let me kind of try to show you. This is my seam right here, and you just clip that, but don't clip all the way through that sewing right there, through that seam, or you know you'll have a hole where your sewing is. So I've just clipped all these raw edges here, all throughout the whole quilt, and I've saved one so I can kind of show you what it looks like and show you how you need to do it. This right here, I haven't, but see, this normally when I had before, let me get my hand out of the way, when I've sewn across this, see how I've sewn across that, and that you have to cut that right there at that little edge so that these are free, kind of, you know, will flow freely. And so you have to cut that right there in that corner, and then you need to go along here and cut all these edges. So I left this, you know, some of these edges done so you could kind of see what I was talking about, that you have to clip this corner, because normally when it's sewn it will look like this. And so see, you have to clip that right there all the way down to where it's sewn right there, and then that will let that come together. See how like it doesn't want to come out completely, but when you clip that little edge right there and then you get all these clipped, it'll flow freer. And then I, you know, at my last step, I had gone around and sewed all around the edge, and then I clipped all around the edge. And so I've got just a few more seams I have to clip here, and then this quilt will be done, and I'll show y'all the finished product after it's over with. I think it really turned out good, and I'm real happy with it, and I hope, you know, it'll be the person the recipient of it will like it as well. So let me get this last part done. I wanted to save that and show you that last little step, and then I'll show y'all the finished product, and then my quilt will be completed. So I'll be back in just a little bit.